Okay, so picture this. You walk into your polling place ready to vote, and someone confronts you and demands you prove you can read the Constitution.
Wow.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, right?
It does. It really does sound like something out of a movie or something.
Well, it happened back in 1962 in Phoenix, Arizona.
Wow. I had no idea.
And get this, the guy doing the confronting, he ended up becoming a Supreme Court justice.
No way. Seriously.
Yeah, William Rehnquist.
Rehnquist, huh? Well, that's something.
You've given us some amazing material on Rehnquist and those voter challenges.
Yeah, his early years are really fascinating, and I think you can see how those Arizona experiences really shaped him, laid the groundwork for his whole judicial philosophy later on.
Yeah, that's what we're going to deep dive into today.
Awesome.
We've got archival audio, interviews with historians. We even get some glimpses into Rehnquist's personal life.
Sounds great.
And we're going to explore how these events in Phoenix, they weren't just isolated incidents. They became part of a much bigger national strategy that still impacts voting rights today.
You're so right. It's crucial to understand this historical context. I mean, especially with all the debate today about voter fraud and voter suppression, it really helps us make sense of it all.
Okay, so let's start with Rehnquist himself. You said he was a staunch conservative even as a young man.
Oh, yeah, even back in high school.
What was he like back then?
Well, he was really active in those conservative youth groups and always had strong opinions.
Like what?
Oh, against the New Deal, that sort of thing. And this continued, through his military service, even when he clerked for Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. That was after the war.
Jackson, the Nuremberg trials guy.
That's the one.
Wow, so Rehnquist was already, deeply conservative.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. And remember, this was a time of huge change. The civil rights movement was gaining steam, and the nation was grappling with all these issues of racial equality, voting rights. It was a really charged environment.
And right in the middle of it all, you have Rehnquist involved in these voter challenges in Phoenix.
Yeah, it's really striking. There are accounts, like in the Arizona Republic newspaper, that allege Rehnquist was out there challenging voters, especially in precincts that were predominantly Black and Hispanic.
And how would they do that?
Well, witnesses said they'd use parts of the Constitution as a literacy test to decide if someone could vote or not.
Seriously?
Yeah, and the FBI even investigated Rehnquist for it.
Wow, so this was serious stuff.
It was, although no charges were ever filed.
Did he deny it?
Rehnquist. Oh, he always denied doing anything wrong. He said he was just observing, offering legal advice.
But he did admit to being there, right, at these...
voter challenges.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. He actually called it an election day program, in his own words.
And that's what's so interesting, right? Even if he denied any intent to intimidate voters, his actions definitely reflect this concern about voter fraud that was brewing in the Republican Party.
Exactly. And that concern would become a major driving force behind a much bigger, more organized effort to challenge voters.
Operation Eagle Eye.
That's right. To understand how Operation Eagle Eye came about, we have to look at the politics leading up to the '64 election. You had the Civil Rights Act passing, the 24th Amendment, and a lot of anxiety in the Republican Party about potential voter fraud.
You keep mentioning the 24th Amendment. Can you remind us what that did?
Sure, it abolished poll taxes.
Right.
So you had this big barrier to voting removed, especially for African Americans in the South who'd been kept from voting by these taxes.
And Republicans saw that as a threat.
Well, some did. They worried about a surge in voters who might lean Democrat.
So that anxiety, plus the worries about voter fraud, it was like the perfect storm that led to Operation Eagle Eye.
Exactly. And it's in this climate that you see Barry Goldwater, another big Arizona figure. And the Republican nominee in '64, he really gets behind these voter challenge efforts. Oh, Goldwater was a real staunch conservative, strong beliefs about voter fraud, thought it was a huge threat.
And a lot of Republicans agreed with him, saw this Operation Eagle Eye as a way to protect elections. Right.
Yeah, and it wasn't just in Arizona either. This was a national thing, all coordinated to challenge voters all over, especially where you had lots of minorities.
So how did it work? What were they actually doing to challenge these voters?
Well, lots of different tactics.
Like what?
One thing they did was send out these mailers to voters, in areas that leaned Democrat, questioning if they were really eligible to vote, demanding they prove they lived where they said they did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, can you imagine? Lots of confusion, probably scared some people off, especially first-time voters or folks who weren't sure how it all worked.
Sounds like they were trying to make people too nervous to even show up.
I think you're right. And then they'd have these poll watchers, too.
Oh, right. I've heard about those.
They'd be right there at the polls, challenging people's right to vote on the spot, sometimes for the flimsiest reasons.
Like what?
Oh, questioning someone's address or like what Rehnquist was doing, challenging their ability to read.
And the point of all this was to stop people from voting, especially if they were likely to vote Democrat.
That's the idea. And from what I've read, Operation Eagle Eye, they wanted to stop like 1.25 million voters from casting ballots in '64.
Wow, that's a lot of people. We were talking before about archival audio. Did you find anything that gives us a feel for what it was like back then during this whole Operation Eagle Eye thing?
You know what I did? I found this clip from one of Goldwater's campaign ads. It really shows how they talked about these voter challenges back then, how they justified it all.
Let's hear it.
Okay, here it is.
Whoa, that's really something. It's like they're saying they're the ones protecting democracy when their opponents saw it as a way to silence voters, especially minorities.
That's the heart of the debate, isn't it? Is it about stopping fraud, or is it about keeping certain people from voting? It's a question we're still wrestling with today.
Especially in places like Maricopa County, Arizona, right?
hmm
That's become a real hotbed for voter fraud allegations.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can see echoes of Operation Eagle Eye in what's going on now. They even have this software called Eagle AI designed to make it easier to challenge voter registrations.
It's like history repeating itself, only now it's high-tech instead of mailers and poll watchers.
It makes you think, how is technology going to shape our elections? Is it going to make things fairer, or is it just a new way to keep certain people from voting? It's a big question.
Yeah, it definitely is. So we've talked about these big organized efforts to influence elections, but you've also shared some really cool stories about a completely different approach, something more from the ground up, right?
Right, these grassroots movements where everyday people get together and make their voices heard. It's pretty inspiring stuff.
Tell me more.
Well, there's this great example in Michigan, this Arab American community in Dearborn, just outside Detroit. They went from feeling completely powerless to becoming a real force in local politics.
Really? How did that happen?
It all started in the factories, believe it or not. The factories. How did that work?
That's what I was wondering.
So Dearborn had this neighborhood, the South End, became like a center for Arab Americans back in the mid-20th century. A lot of them found work in the auto industry at that giant Ford Rouge factory.
Right, the Rouge plant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It provided jobs, but the conditions were tough, and there was a lot of discrimination too.
So the factory became a place where people started organizing, like a breeding ground for activism.
Yeah, you had the civil rights movement going strong all over the country, and Detroit was right at the heart of it with its large black population. And the Arab Americans in Dearborn, they were facing similar issues, so they found common ground, working together, demanding fair treatment and fair pay.
It sounds like that shared experience really brought those communities together.
Definitely, it was a powerful bond forged in the struggle, and it went way beyond just the factory floor. It spilled over into politics.
So those early years in the factories, they laid the groundwork for later political activism.
Absolutely.
What were some of the big issues that got them fired up?
Well, on top of fighting for workers' rights, they were also trying to save their neighborhood, the South End.
What was happening there?
The city was trying to rezone it for heavy industry, which would have pushed a lot of people out.
So potential displacement on top of everything else.
Right, and it really resonated with them, especially given what was going on in the Middle East at the time.
You mean with the Palestinians?
Exactly. A lot of Arab Americans saw a direct connection between what might happen to them in Dearborn and what Palestinians were going through, losing their land. It gave their activism a real sense of urgency. They knew they had to make their voices heard.
It's amazing how personal experiences like that, even if they seem totally separate from politics, can become a catalyst for political action.
Yeah, it's like this light bulb goes off and suddenly everything's connected. And that connection became even stronger during the '73 Arab-Israeli War.
I bet that was a really intense time for them.
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge shock to the Arab American community in Dearborn. They felt this overwhelming need to do something to support those affected by the conflict.
And by that point, they were ready to take action, right? They'd learned how to organize from their time in the factories and fighting for their neighborhood.
You got it. They were ready to flex their political muscles, and they decided to target their own union, the UAW.
United Auto Workers.
Yep. Seems the Arab Workers Caucus within the UAW found out the union had invested a bunch of money in Israeli bonds.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, they saw it as directly supporting the conflict, basically funding what they called the murder of their brothers and sisters back home.
So they challenged the UAW.
They did, big time. They demanded the union divest from Israeli bonds, they organized protests, ran ads in the papers, even went on a wildcat strike.
A wildcat strike. What's that?
It's basically a strike that's not authorized by the union leadership. It's risky, you could get fired, but they felt like they had to do something drastic.
Wow, that took guts. What happened?
Well, it caused a lot of disruption. The UAW leadership had to pay attention. In the end, they didn't divest completely, but they did sell off some of those Israeli bonds.
So partial victory, but still pretty amazing.
It was. It showed that Arab American workers were a force to be reckoned with. They were willing to stand up for what they believed in, even against their own union. It really showed the power of collective action.
And it didn't stop there, right?
Nope. It had this ripple effect. It gave the whole Arab American community in Dearborn the confidence to really dive into politics. They started running for office, advocating for their community, demanding to be heard.
It's an incredible story, going from feeling marginalized to becoming a force for change.
It's a powerful reminder that even when things seem impossible, change can happen from the ground up. It just takes people coming together, pushing for a more just and equitable world.
Wow, it's been an amazing deep dive.
It has.
I mean, we've gone from the halls of power with Rehnquist and Operation Eagle Eye to the factory floors of Dearborn. But both stories, they really show how much the struggle for voting rights has shaped this country.
Yeah, you can see that tension, right? Between those who want to restrict access to the ballot box and those who want to expand it. It's a fight that's still going on today in courts, legislatures, and in communities all over the country.
It's a reminder that we can't take our democracy for granted.
Absolutely. The right to vote is fundamental. It's something we have to protect and fight for constantly.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've really only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
I know, right? And it's up to all of us to dig deeper, learn more, and figure out how we can make our democracy work better for everyone.
So as we wrap up, I keep thinking about those two approaches we talked about, the top-down strategies and the grassroots movements.
Yeah, those two different ways of trying to influence the system.
What can we learn from them? Both the good and the bad. How can we make sure that our elections really represent the will of the people?
It's a big question, something we all need to think about. It's up to each of us to figure out what role we want to play in making our democracy stronger.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.